All right, you ready?
Welcome back.
Hey, want to hear the most annoying sound in the world? Guys!
We lost our one listener we just had.
If they honestly though, if someone tunes out at that, that's probably fine because they're not going to like our show.
Well, first of all, welcome back from your family vacation. The real cold open should be, how was tracking the 97 kids you have through the airport?
Honestly, it's actually first of all, it's funny that you asked that because I did think that was going to be a big deal, but it actually wasn't that bad. So where it was really an issue is when we actually got to our destination. And then, actually, when you're walking through like Disney Springs, we didn't go to any of the parks, but I don't know if you've ever been to Disney Springs, but I mean, there are a ton of people there. So the real issue was just like trying to wrangle them through all the crowds. So yeah, and tracking 97 of them without leashes or GPS trackers, not easy to do.
Sometimes I wish I had a leash that I could just walk and just people could pull me back. And like when I go to Costco, it's a problem.
What I have told my wife jokingly, but like kind of serious, is when we go on walks, the little one, the 2-year-old, will still sit in a stroller, and she often is like sitting there and like snacking, and and I'm thinking that'd be awesome if like there was like an adult stroller that somebody could push me around in and go on a walk, and I could just sit and eat and drink. That'd be amazing.
It's called a wheelchair.
I didn't consider that. I did not consider
that. That transitions beautifully into the topic of today, where we are talking about a concept. Specifically, we're talking about the book, The Hungry Brain, and we're going to talk about some of the core topics in here. I don't know if you want to kick it off or if you want me to kick it off. Because I have some history with this, actually.
Yeah, this happens to be one of my favorite books I've ever read. I've wanted to get Stefan on this podcast for the longest time. I don't know how to. You're gonna have to text him sometime, see if he wants to come on. I would love to pick his brain, but in the meantime, we're gonna have to pick the book. But yeah, I mean, I can kick us off. I mean, essentially, this book, for anybody that doesn't know about it or hasn't heard of it, yeah, it's called The Hungry Brain: Outsmarting the Brain that wants to it's about the brain that wants to overeat. That's the premises. Outsmarting the things that make us overeat is kind of what he dives into, and he goes into why we overeat. He talks about the neurobiology behind that type of behavior, and it's basically the core idea is that our brains evolved in a food scarce world, because it used to be that we had to hunt for our food. Brad's talked about this many times in our podcast, and now we live in a world of food abundance, and that mismatch is why we struggle. That's kind of the premise of the book. So yeah, and I did write down a quote from this. Your brain is designed to keep you alive, not lean. So that's one of the things he kind of talks about as well. So I love the book, but you can kick us off in terms of, I guess, where you'd like to start, if there is a particular place you'd like to start. I had sort of planned that maybe we talk about the hyperpalatability hijack, going into hyperpalatable food, since that is one of the things he talks about a lot. But honestly, wherever you want to start, if you had something in mind, we can do that.
So I think before we dive into actual science, I think the history of there's basically like 3 or 4 interesting histories that are intertwined, and specifically like this book that I think should get talked about before we actually dive into the science. So health writing on the internet and like free content, long form content, blog form really started in earnest in like the late 2000, early 2010 decade. And what was interesting is there was a handful of people, and I'll put myself in there as like one of the least important people at the time, but I was writing long form content, and I don't even think you can find my websites anymore, about basically food, nutrition, health, disease, etc. And this was kind of on the heels of, and the history here is actually fairly important. This is on the heels of the 90s and early 2000s, which was about cardiovascular disease, and then the rise of obesity pretty dramatically and the development of type 2 diabetes and our understanding of metabolic syndrome, the brain, all sorts of things. And so it was really interesting is around this time, there was a huge amount of discussion about the nutrients of food. So paleo became very popular, low carb became very popular. Processed food, industrialization, all of these things became super popular topics to talk about. There was only really one person at this time who came to it from a different perspective of let's step back and let's ask the real question of why do we eat? And that was Stefan. And he was actually at UW at the time. I was in WSU/Idaho. So he was actually fairly close to me.
And again, real quick, I just want to point out for anybody who's joining, Stefan is the author of the book that we're talking about. So yeah.
And so he was actually one of the first people to have this concept of like, hey, maybe it's less about the macronutrients per se and more about the overall quality of our diet and how it dictates our brain and how we make food choices. And what was really interesting was his views and his writing was like not antithetical to what like the common shtick of like low carb, whatever, but it was very much a different perspective. And so there was a lot of like conflict between his ideas and all these other ones. And to his credit, he remained pretty on point for decades with the same thing. And he actually went and developed an entire like framework of how this works. And he built it into this book, but you can actually go and read the original source literature on his website. It was wholehealthsource.blogspot.com. This is like how old this stuff is, which I mean, for us, it's not that old, but it's like almost 20 years old now. It's like 15, 20 years old. And so really interesting. And so as we go into some of the topics of this book, I think it's important to just take the perspective of what we're going to talk about is really a layer of understanding about how food and human behavior intersect and how that behavior drives downstream health consequences. So this is basically like, think about this as a layer abstracted from calories and macronutrients. And I think that's an important distinction to make. So with that being said, I think we can jump into it.
Yeah. So the hyperpalatability. Now, I should also back up and clarify. It has been a little while since I've gone back to the book, so I don't specifically remember what topics he jumps from, from A to B to C and so forth. But one of the things that really stood out to me was we talk about hyperpalatable foods that combine multiple rewarding elements: fat, sugar, salt, fine carbs. And those don't exist in nature. They're man-made. They're engineered to override your natural, I'm full signals. And if you think of them like the food equivalent of gambling slots, for example, these randomized reward spikes that keep you coming back for more, it's like that's built into our food. And it sort of hijacks our brain chemistry, that dopamine feedback loop, right? So if dopamine is your brain's motivational currency, so to speak, that drives behavior toward more rewards. And those hyperpalatable foods spike that dopamine beyond what whole foods would do for you, which make you crave them more, think about them more, and then feel less satisfied, actually, ironically, after eating them because you just want more. So the more you eat, the more the brain downregulates those dopamine receptors. And so over time, you need more food to feel the same reward, right? So we eat, then we crave more, we're not as satisfied, then we repeat, and then you're like, why can't I stop? Like I'm going. And we see this all the time in the group. People are like, I can't stop. Like this has been a horrible day and I just can't stop eating. So I think that is I think we should dive into that part first. And he also discusses the basal ganglia, which, if they my takeaway from that was that's a very strong reason why these are our habits and behaviors that we keep looping over and over back through. It's like that's a big part of why, because the basal ganglia controls so much. I don't know if that's the right word, but influences so much of our behavior that it really is very difficult to undo a lot of those habits that are so deeply ingrained in us, especially when dopamine is that motivator. So um, does it make sense? I think to me it makes sense to start with the hyperpalatability part. I mean, what was your takeaway of that part of the book when he discusses all of that?
Yeah, so I think before we dive into that, I think it's actually probably the first place to start is if we take a step back and like pull back a layer and really talk about what we're actually talking about is the systems in the brain that drive habit formation and behaviors. And so we can talk about like all the substructures in the brain, like, you know, the basal ganglia, the arcuate nucleus, the hypothalamus. Like there's all these structures, but if we abstract it to what actually matters to us is there are biological reasons why we make decisions. And
Mm-hmm.
if you strip it down to like its most basic form is it comes down to the reward system or the feedback that you get, right? If we think about this sort of like how all AI models work right now is they guess an outcome, and if they get close, they get a point, and if they're far away, they get a 0, and they keep guessing until they get close enough to where it's like actually correct. And so that's like
Mm-hmm.
reinforcement learning.
Yep.
That's the same way the brain works, except for how it knows if it's right or not is a neurotransmitter based reward, in which
Right.
generally for us, this is dopamine, right? So dopamine's like the, oh, right answer, right? You get an answer right on a test, it's dopamine. And that's fundamentally what we talk about when we talk about behaviors in general. But now when we talk about this in the context of food, this is what is happening. And so you actually drive behaviors and decision making around food based on this reward system. And so if you think, okay, if I give you 100 calories of celery and I give you 100 calories of brownies, one of those, regardless of like taste and things like that, one of those is actually going to drive more reward in your brain than the other one. And it's the brownie,
For
right?
sure.
Than the celery. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is through evolution, our brains have been wired to give higher reward to foods that have certain properties. Some of them are like energy density,
For
right?
sure.
So things that have more energy density, we generally tend to get more reward from. That's why things that have like more butter on them taste better. Like we're just engineered to seek higher calories because that means we're more likely to survive. So this like deep evolutionary system in our brain is what drives behaviors. And so then if we then kind of take this into what we think about in terms of the modern food environment, a lot of the foods that are produced, manufactured, created, and made in restaurants are designed to optimize our reward system. So you look at the food you eat, it's usually perfectly salted, it's perfectly sweet, it's perfectly savory, it's perfectly crunchy. It's like it's got all of the things designed so you get the most amount of reward. Now from a like economics industrial standpoint, that's great because you buy more of it. From a body
Yep.
perspective, it's acutely great because you get more calories. So your body's like, hey, my chance of survival is greater. But in the longer form sense, you've overloaded the system with energy, which actually, when you continue to do that on a day to day basis, is going to cause problems. And so this book really talks about how these systems work and how we think about our diet from the perspective of let's take all the other aspects of food out of it and just talk about how do we help drive reasonable calorie intake through food selection. That's what this book's focused on.
Yeah, and I know that so another really good thing I think the book does and that he talks about is he does like an overview of, well, not an overview, but he dives into like different key areas of the brain. He talks about the hypothalamus, which is responsible for regulating hunger signals. He talks about the reward system. which we just talked about, drives the desire to eat based on cues, environmental cues, whatever. The prefrontal cortex, which is like your impulse control, which we often lose that battle. He talks about how stress, sleep deprivation, those things weaken the brain's, brakes, so to speak. And what was really interesting to me is going back to the part where he talks about the basal ganglia. One of the things that I read, you can read some of this in people's Amazon reviews about the book, is that they almost, it's like, I don't want to say deflecting responsibility from their own decisions and choices, but it was almost like we're saying this part of our brain called the basal ganglia is responsible for where we're at. But he basically is like, listen, they are, basal ganglia are a set of structures deep inside the brain. They're heavily involved in habit formation, motor control, and these automatic behavior loops that we're talking about. And once a behavior becomes repetitive enough, it gets offloaded to the basal ganglia so it can run on basically autopilot. So that's why we don't feel, without conscious input from the prefrontal cortex, which is where our willpower comes from, like you're just on autopilot. So if you think of it like, like your brain saves energy by making frequent pit stops to these scripts that it's familiar with. You hit play and the behavior runs without you realizing it. So that's why it's so easy to just get into these deeply ingrained habit loops. And like, how to get out of it is where people really need the help. And I think where I would be interested in going next, and we can get there, but if there's other things we want to tackle first, but I think knowing this and about how the brain works and how habits are formed, what do we do about it, right? Like, how do we get out of it if the habits in the in the basal ganglia don't require hunger or reasoning or emotional motivation? They just activate whenever the cue hits. Like, that's why people find themselves eating without even noticing. They're just doing it out of habit. So like, how the heck are we supposed to get out of these loops when most of the time we don't even realize that we're doing it, right? So he touches on that by explaining how much eating is actually cue based versus unconscious eating, not driven by true psychological hunger. I think that one of the things that you have control over is, and I know we've talked about this before, is is it psychological hunger, or is it true psychological hunger, or is it just something else? Differentiating those two, I think, is a big key toward digging ourselves out of this this loop, so to speak. Yeah. What do you got to say about that?
So there's a couple layers to the answers within this, and I'm trying to think about how deep I want to go on this. The concepts in this book point out something very important, at least from my perspective. One is your biology drives a lot of your decision making. And I think it's important to understand that, like, when you're struggling to make good food choices consistently, there's a deep sense of like biological forces that are driving you to make decisions in which like the chips are really stacked against you making the decision opposite of what your biology is loaded to do, right? However, when you understand that, you can actually then take a look at, okay, what would the conditions have to be such that I can engineer my situation to have a different decision? And what it comes down to is simple choices about your environment and your lifestyle are what are going to drive most of your decision making. And so I don't know if you've ever listened to some of his interviews, the author of the book, Stefan, and I interviewed him back in 2013, so 12 years ago. And if you take all of like the deep neurobiology of his book, layer it on with kind of the complex things that drive human behavior, with all of the environmental factors stacked against us, and you kind of boil it down to very basic concepts, it really comes down to, can I set up my environment to where my food choices are simple and they minimize the amount of like overtly unnecessary food reward on a daily basis, right? And if you got to like paint two extreme examples of this, right? You can eat a diet that is as far on the high reward spectrum as possible, right? Like you can get up and you can go get a McDonald's breakfast sandwich with a orange juice and a grande mocha, right? That's like as engineered to be high food reward as possible, right? It's perfectly salty, it's savory, there's some sweetness in there, there's probably some crunch from the bacon on the sandwich. You've got the caffeine that's coming in that's giving you the food reward from that. Like there's that type of diet. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's like the egg white omelet with no salt, right?
That sounds awful. I don't want
Like
that one.
if you were to put them on the extremes, right? One of those is going to cause you to consume a large amount of calories and get a huge amount of enjoyment and reward out of your food. And the other one's going to be like, this is terrible, but I have to eat, right? And so the idea is, how can you structure a diet that is more on the side of low food reward as you can while still enjoying your food? So like when I think about how I set up my diet in a given day, it's generally around like enjoyable but low food reward foods, right? Like I will, if I'm having dinner, it will be like some steak or chicken, lightly seasoned, some plain rice or potatoes or pasta, and some vegetables with a little bit of salt and stuff here or there, right? It's very rare that it's like, hey, a bag of Doritos with gosh, I'm trying to even think because we just don't eat like that in our house. With pizza pockets and Kool-Aid, right? Like those are very different. Even if we were to have the same calorie and macronutrient content, like the reward systems you're driving are going to be very different. And it's much easier to control calorie intake when your next bite, you're not chasing food reward. And I think that's an important part that we can talk about. Like, if you think about when's the last time you and your wife went out to like a really nice dinner and had like a really awesome dessert? Probably when you guys were on vacation.
Yeah, I was going to say just last week. Yeah.
Right. Now, if you pay attention, like the first time you take the bite of the dessert, it's great. Then to get that same like level of reward from that first bite, you probably have to take 2 bites. Right. And like that's, if you think about that and you think about, okay, the last time you had like some grilled chicken that didn't have some crazy sauce on it, like, yeah, the first bite was pretty good. And the last bite was probably pretty similar to the first bite. Like when you finish the chicken, you're like, oh, that was good. You're not like, oh my God, I wish I had more chicken.
Yeah.
And so you just think about like the food choices and how they drive the behaviors around eating. And then when we talk about like the food noise piece, if you are constantly going after food that has high food reward, what do you think the likelihood that you're going to be thinking about food when you're not eating is? It's going to be high. If you're eating a relatively simple diet that's like, it's enjoyable, it's tasty, but it doesn't have this huge amount of reward, it's a much lower likelihood that you're going to be thinking about eating a specific food when you're not eating it regularly.
Yeah, he goes into, and those are really good points, and he talks a lot about that too, and he goes into basically the 2 systems of hunger. And I know we've talked about this in multiple episodes, but for those watching who have never seen any of the other episodes and aren't sure, he basically talks about homeostatic hunger, which is driven by real, like actual biological signals, low blood sugar, an empty stomach, things like that, regulated by actual hormones like ghrelin and leptin. And then he talks about hedonic hunger, cue driven. So like I guess a good example would be, let's say you walk past a bakery or someone's baking cookies. My wife made cookies the other day, and I smell it and I'm like, damn, I'm hungry. Like that smells awesome. Now I want cookies. I wasn't actually hungry, but now I suddenly am. And that's not biological hunger, right? Or you see a candy, this is a big one. You see a bowl of candy at work. You reach in without thinking just because it's there. right? Or you always eat dessert after dinner, which we did that down in when we were on vacation. But your brain expects it even if you're full. So like we have these patterns of just that we do things out of habit rather than out of actual homeostatic hunger. And those are automatic behaviors that they feel like hunger, but they're actually driven by conditioned responses to things that we've ingrained, in our life. And so then, and he also talks about, like, one of the benefits of the book is that he explains all these things. And I think what was really beneficial is, it's like, okay, so what else can we do about it? The things that he recommends are, the I think the number one big thing is fix your food environment first, right? I think his strongest and most repeated recommendation is to control your environment. Don't rely on willpower, because he's basically saying you can't out discipline your brain, but you can redesign your life to work. Redesign your rewire your brain, to work with your brain instead of against it, right? So he's
Yeah.
like,
I mean,
so
you
fix
think
fix
about,
fix
like,
your environment.
how your brain makes this is so weird. Your brain knows how your brain makes decisions, right? So when you put it in an environment that puts all of the input signals to make one decision and then ask it to make another, it's terrible, right? It's
Yeah.
like, this is not going to work. And so you have to figure out, okay, how does my brain make decisions? How do I construct the environment such that my brain makes the decision I want it to make?
Yep. Yeah, and he talks about, like, so okay, so well, let's dive into real quick. What does the environment look like? Well, so how do I better structure my environment? A couple of suggestions he makes: don't keep those hyper palatable foods in your house. If it's not within reach, you're less likely to actually go for it. That's why some people just completely abstain. Make healthy foods, the healthy foods, more convenient. So you, like, instead of a bowl of candy, maybe you have a bowl of fruit that's visible at all times. Pre-prepping your proteins and veggies, things like that. Using larger containers for whole foods. I think out of sight equals out of mouth is the big one. Like, even seeing food can trigger cravings, so that's why it's important to control your environment, right? So you're essentially reducing your exposure to the cues that activate your brain's reward systems. Less exposure means fewer cravings, means less need for willpower. And the other one that he is big on is eating foods that promote satiety. So, in other words, eating in a way that makes you feel fuller for longer. It reduces the need for food reward, right? It's because, like, he basically says satiety is the brain's primary defense against overeating. So he recommends more protein, because we know protein has a high satiety effect. Whole and minimally processed foods, high fiber intake, and especially avoiding foods that contain, like, high amounts of fats and carbs together. So unfortunately, that means like pizza and fries and, like, delicious things, ice cream. But essentially, that combo is highly rewarding and rarely satisfying in the end. So there's other recommendations that he makes, but I think another one is, like, eating mindfully with structure, sleep more. So just a few recommendations that he makes, that I think are actually things we can do and actually apply to our lives.
Correct.
Where's my correct button? Here.
That's correct.
There, got it. This is where people stop watching. So what do you have? I mean, whatever you want to talk about. I've kind of covered the main points that I really loved about the book. But what do you? Are there anything else that you think we should dive into and that would be beneficial for our viewers about the book?
I mean, I think there's a layer of personal responsibility and biology that sometimes is really difficult to wrestle with. Like, from a just like personal experience, you kind of get to the situation, you're like, well, like, ultimately I'm responsible for my choices, but my biology kind of drives things. So, like, what am I actually supposed to do? What does this mean? And when I talk about these kind of concepts with clients, is there's a few ways to look at this. you can get really lost in the details of like why things happen, who's ultimately responsible, can I even make these choices, etc. And what I try to tell people is none of that actually means anything or matters. When you get that far into your head about it, it just becomes this exercise of like, I'm trying to justify things or rationalize why things are. And the only thing that really matters is the next time you have to make a choice, make a good choice. And so what that comes down to is how do you structure your environment and stack as many chips as you can in favor of making the decision you want to make? And realizing that life is very messy and situations on the ground change all day, every day. And so it's
Well, I've said,
so it's
go
trying
ahead,
to
go ahead.
control what you can control. You know, when I think about this from like, let's just say, not from a food perspective, but let's just like an exercise going to the gym perspective. Like now that, you know, we have our first kid here, like schedules are definitely different. And so I can do a lot of things to stack the chips in my favor that I'm going to go to the gym today, or I can stack a lot of things, chips in my favor that I probably won't go to the gym today. Right. And so for me, it's like, okay, what do I know will increase the likelihood that I go to the gym? It's like, one, try to schedule my meetings so that when I have a break in my meetings from a day, that's a time when maybe the kiddo's going down for a nap so I can actually go do something, right? It's let's try not to book a whole bunch of social things on the days that I have fewer meetings so I can use that time to go to the gym. Hey, it's make sure I have all my chores done so on like during the week, so on Saturday when I have some free time, I can get to the gym and not spend it doing all the other things. So it's things like that. So when we talk about food choices and like lowering food noise, it's like, okay, how do I stack the chips in my favor that I'm going to make good choices? It's let's be really selective about the groceries we buy. Let's be really selective about how often and where we go out to eat. Let's be very selective about how much alcohol is in the house and how much we consume. Like those are all things that you can make decisions in the moment
To affect your environment.
for in the future that affect how you make a decision in that moment in the future, right? Like when you're buying groceries for the week, that's a much different decision than ordering off of a menu at a restaurant. And so it's like there's a lot of abstract there. So you can make these decisions that stack the chips in your favor of, hey, a week from now when I have to make a food choice, what's going to be in my house, right? Or it's like, hey, my work week's going to be crazy. If I pack all my lunches, the likelihood of me Uber Eating whatever is going to be much lower. And so it's really about just thinking ahead to make the decisions for your brain easier in the future.
Yeah, and I want to also mention that everything that you're saying that the book recommends, it's not saying that it's going to be easy, because the thing that people you'll realize is just because you're making these decisions that impact your environment and make it easier for you to stop overeating, it'll take some time to get used to. Like, but the interesting thing that happens is once you get into a routine, a few weeks go by, like it just kind of becomes your new life, right? Like the habits do eventually stick. You just have to get, those first couple of weeks are the hardest part. But when you make those changes, it does eventually get easier. It's really just you got to push through the first part, which is the hardest. I did just ask. I asked our friendly AI to give me a few extra points, just so I could read this to you guys about other things that Stefan, the author of this book, The Hungry Brain, recommends for what we can do about not trying to outsmart our brains or out discipline it, but what can we do to avoid overeating? So it came up with a list. The first couple I've already talked about, which was fix your food environment first. So like not eating hyper palatable foods, keeping those kinds of foods out of sight, out of mind. The other one was eating foods that are higher in satiety. So like protein and other foods that keep you feeling
Potatoes.
fuller. That's another good example. Here are the other ones that I wrote down. I'll just read these to you guys. So the third recommendation is, I did kind of mention this one actually. Eat mindfully. So instead of trying to wing it throughout the day, Guyenet encourages structured eating times. So don't graze throughout the day. Avoid distractions during meals. So example, eating while watching TV. Portion your food before eating. Don't eat straight from the container. Slow down. This is interesting. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes for satiety signals to register. Why this works? This gives your prefrontal cortex, the control center, a better chance to stay engaged. It also helps the brain detect fullness before it's too late. So that's really interesting to me about like slowing down a little bit. And then stress less. So Guyenet calls out sleep deprivation as a key risk factor. It increases ghrelin, the hunger hormone. It decreases leptin, the satiety hormone. It weakens impulse control, and it increases reward-seeking behavior. Hello donuts at 11 p.m. Stress, meanwhile, activates emotional eating and reward-seeking patterns, especially if those foods are nearby and easy to access. Why this works? You're giving your brain the basic physiological support it needs to self-regulate. No amount of discipline can override a tired, stressed out brain. And then the final one, accept that some foods need a hard boundary. Guyenet doesn't advocate for doesn't advocate full restriction, but he is realistic. Some foods are simply too tempting to keep around if your goal is to eat less. So he encourages identifying your personal trigger foods, the ones where a little becomes a lot, creating friction. Don't ban it forever, but make it harder to get. And setting personal policies. I don't eat XYZ at home, or I only have dessert when eating out. Why this works? These boundaries reduce decision fatigue and help automate better choices. So there you have it. So those are his recommendations. We have a question here from Michelle Grace. I believe Michelle has asked questions before. She seems to be a repeat commenter. So we appreciate
She's the
that.
only listener left after your bad start to this episode.
That was a great start. What are you talking about? She says, I'm about halfway through the book and love it. Can you please explain the lipostat and how it can change? That's a good one. I like that. Yeah.
So there's a theory about human weight regulation that's pretty well supported by the literature about that we basically have effectively a thermostat in our body that helps regulate body fatness. And what's called the lipostat because it's for fat tissue like lipo. But basically, the way that it works conceptually is our body produces a hormone known as leptin, and it's produced by our fat tissue. And it's basically read, the amount, like the levels in the body are read by a part of our brain called the hypothalamus. And the theory here is as your body fat levels go up and you produce more leptin, it tells your body that you have enough body fat. So you need to reduce energy intake and increase energy expenditure so you don't accumulate too much body fat. And then when it gets too low and there's not as much, it signals your body to increase energy intake and decrease energy expenditure. This is one of the mechanisms by which we can help regulate body weight. And we actually see this, like when you look at the trials of short-term overfeeding people, and some people won't gain much weight because they start to increase their energy expenditure through NEAT, and we've talked about that before. This is one of the things that controls it. Now, there's a few interesting pieces of this. One, we know this exists and we know it works in some situations, but the question is, if this works, why do we have people who have become overweight or have obesity? Right. And it simply comes down to a few things. One, rapid rises in adiposity coupled with a deregulated metabolic environment causes the leptin signaling to not work very well. And so you can actually, what you see is the leptin system itself, in terms of leptin levels rising with obesity, definitely happens. So I actually gave a talk on this now 7 years ago. But as people as their BMI goes up, their leptin goes up. Okay. But what's also interesting is leptin levels also increase with insulin resistance, regardless of BMI. So if you look at people's fasting glucose, which is a marker of insulin resistance, leptin levels also go up. And so there's a theory of people probably develop leptin resistance similar to how they develop insulin resistance. And so that's interesting. Now, the initial discovery of leptin would say, okay, well, what happens if we give people leptin who are overweight or have obesity? Does that result in weight loss? And it turns out that like giving people leptin as a therapy doesn't really do much. In fact, people who receive placebo and leptin end up with basically the same amount of weight loss. And it probably comes down to the fact that people who have obesity probably have some level of leptin resistance. And so this lipostat's not working effectively. And we actually do see this. And so here was a study in which they gave lean people and people who had obesity exogenous leptin and looked at how much it increases energy expenditure. And people who were lean, leptin worked, and the people who had obesity, it didn't. And so effectively, these like old evolutionary systems that help us maintain body adiposity and kind of short stints. Like if you think about the way we evolved to eat, you may go through periods of gaining a little bit of weight, like when food was super abundant, but it wasn't super abundant all the time. And so basically this leptin resistance is one of the reasons why we don't maintain body weight as well. But when you lose weight, leptin signaling returns. And so it functions very similarly to insulin resistance, and they kind of go hand in hand.
Can you repeat the part of the stuff where you said all about the things?
I really enjoyed that. That was pretty good, though. Honestly, no. On a serious note, that's very interesting. When you were doing that, I did look up the relationship between leptin resistance and insulin resistance. So I was reading a little bit about that as you were talking. That's it's super interesting, and it also says, can you reverse leptin resistance? There's no instant fix, but improving leptin sensitivity is possible through reducing inflammation, improved diet quality, exercise, sleep, and weight loss itself. So that to me reads a lot like the same thing as you would say about insulin, right? So, yeah, so that's an interesting that it's interesting there's a relationship there.
Well, and there's actual data on that too. I'll share this slide as well. So what they've done is they've also given, I mean, leptin in theory helps people. It should make you feel fuller from the same amount of food, and it should make you eat less food, right? And so what we see is when people, after you've lost weight, the exogenous or pharmaceutical-based leptin actually has a better effect than it does when you are carrying an excess amount of body weight.
Sorry, did you say that this was that a study you participated in, or this was just a
no? It was a study that was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2012.
Okay. Does anyone have any more questions for us? Because Michelle Grace, oh, she said fascinating. Thank you. Yes, you're welcome. That was all me. It wasn't Brad. You're welcome. It was so me. So you're so welcome. But seriously, thanks for the question, Michelle. That was super interesting and helpful, and hopefully everyone else found it to be the same. So if anyone has any questions, we have a little bit of time left where we can answer people's questions, or at least do the best job we can. So fire away if anyone wants to know any more. I think, I don't know, this is, if anybody is interested, like I said, it's called The Hungry Brain. You can get it on Amazon, of course. You can do the audiobook or hard copy, whatever, but super good book. I'd highly recommend it. Brad, while we're on the topic of books in this, of this genre or topic, whatever you want to call it, are there any other books off the top of your head you'd recommend that would, touch on this sort of thing?
I'm trying to think. That's a good question.
Do you want me to look in my books behind my?
No. So it's funny. As I was rearranging my office this weekend, and I was going through all my books. What's really interesting is a lot of the like core theories of like the rise in obesity in the modern environment. If you read the books, they basically all cite the same evidence, and they all come to very different conclusions. And a lot of those conclusions are at like direct odds for one another. And so what's really interesting to do is to go through and like read the books. Like, for example, this is one of the books, Gary Taubes, Why We Get Fat and Good Calories, Bad Calories.
Oh yeah, I won't even comment about that one.
Yeah, he has a much different theory of what drives human obesity, and they cite a lot of the same studies. Like the opening literature of this book and that book is almost the same.
So is it it's just the interpretation that's different, is what you're suggesting?
It is. It's a little bit of the interpretation, but it's the attention to the things that matter and the details of what's actually happening. And so the concept of what we talk about in this book kind of pulls away another layer of abstraction to actually get at the truth. And so, like, for example, in both books, they cite these stories of like these indigenous populations that then ended up being exposed to modern industrial food and developing obesity in a culture that had never been there. So they cite like the Catawbans, the Pima Indians, etc., right? And Gary's thesis in his book is, hey, it's the processed carbohydrates that drive insulin that drive obesity, right? That's one theory. Stefan's interpretation is, hey, you introduce these foods that change our behavior around food specifically, so we consume more calories, and we can't regulate our intake as well, and so we develop obesity. And so you can take those two theories and you go, okay, you use the same data, you come to different conclusions. And then how do you get to the truth is you go, okay, is there any data out there that would directly refute my hypothesis? And for the like carbohydrate, insulin, obesity model, there is direct evidence to refute that, right? We know that you can actually take and you can manipulate serum levels of insulin, you can manipulate dietary carbohydrates, and within the context of like calorie deficits, calorie surpluses, etc., we know that's just not true. Like the actual outcome-based data is not there. And so you can take the initial conditions and initial data, and you can come to different conclusions, but then you have to go through the work of like, is there anything that directly refutes this? And in his book, he actually kind of goes through some of these things. And so he talks about like, there's things in here where he talks about like, you know, drugs activate the same circuits, but they do it to much less of an extent. So how does that work? Are there situations in which this doesn't apply? Are there some unanswered questions? And so I think when you kind of boil it down, like that's how you kind of get to what is a model that's more reflective of the world than what's not.
Did you ever see that? I think it was on Rogan where Taubes was talking to, I think it was Chris Kresser. Did you ever see that one?
Well, Chris, Stefan and Gary were on his show as well together.
Stefan was there?
Yeah.
I
did a separate
recall
episode. That. Yeah.
Oh, so okay, gotcha. Yeah. So it wasn't okay. I don't know if I ever saw that one. That's interesting though. But yeah,
it's a tough 3-hour one to get through. It's very uncomfortable.
Well, the one between Kresser and Taubes, you mean?
No, between Stefan and Taubes and Rogan.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's the one I don't think I've seen. I don't even know if I was aware that he was on there. I'll have to go look. Yeah, that's interesting because I remember I do remember the one with Kresser got pretty like kind of ugly. It's like, geez, it's a little you could feel the uncomfortable, sense in the room.
I wrote a post on it. I want to see if I can find it. Can I search my own? I'm sure I can search my own thing.
What's the likelihood you think you could reach out to Stefan and get him on this podcast?
Probably pretty high.
All right. Well, we have to make this happen. I'll email him myself. I'll find his email and just be like, "Hey, I know Brad Dieter, and he said you wanted to come on our podcast."
You know what's really funny is because I was talking to a guy named Luis Villana something. I can't remember his name, how to pronounce his last name. But so he's one of the founders of LMNT, like the kind of liquid IV salty stuff.
Yeah.
And we were just chatting very briefly. There's a handful of us that all kind of started our careers at the same time, and started kind of blogging, doing podcasts way back in the day, and how many of us are still doing it, and how the ones who are left have like made it, so to speak. But how we have all done like totally different things. Like Jordan Syat was on my original podcast way back in the day when he had just dropped out of school and like didn't really know what he was doing, and I was in grad school and didn't know what I was doing. So it's just kind of funny. And Stefan was still doing his blog. He hadn't quit. He hadn't published his book yet, and he was still at UW. So it was interesting.
Do you still keep in touch with Jordan?
Yeah. I mean, we exchange Instagram messages all the time, mostly about like kids and dogs and stuff like that.
Sure.
Yeah,
he'd be another cool one to see if we could get on sometime. That'd be cool to just talk about kind of his insights and his path that he's taken. I mean, obviously, a lot of people know who he is, so I think that'd probably be pretty cool for viewers. But yeah, well, I've pretty much talked about all the things that I wanted to talk about regarding the book. Is there anything else you wanted to add? I mean, we have a little bit of time left, but does not look like we have any more comments. So unless there's something you wanted to chat about, I suppose we can wrap up. Where's little man right now?
Hopefully sleeping, although probably not.
He's already running, right? He's like,
dude, I wish
dribbling the basketball.
We have been working on handles. You know what I mean?
Okay. So what has been, this is off topic, but I mean, since we're here, what's been do you have a like most enjoyable / favorite part of having a kid now? Like, what have you found to be like super rewarding or fun?
I think it's just getting to spend time with my wife and him together. That's been great.
Yeah. I think for me, it was always one of the things I loved the most was just like the cuddle / snuggle time where like when they were little and you can hold them right there and like just lay back and just keep them right there.
Although
and they smell.
Dude, I have such a knot in my left shoulder because I like only hold it on my left shoulder, and I'm like, I need a massage so bad, but I give all my massages to my wife. So,
how many times have you been barfed on by the baby?
Infinite.
Yeah.
Infinite.
That's the one of the fun highlights.
I mean, I don't know. It is what it is. Like, I don't.
Yeah.
It doesn't bother me. Oh.
Well, I don't know, guys. I hope this was.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I found my Facebook post from it. I can't read it. It's so long.
From what?
I'll send it. I'll tag you in this, and you can read my comments on their Joe Rogan.
Oh, okay. How long ago was that already? That's got to be like
6 years. No, it was 6 years ago.
So not that old. I thought it was. I thought it was way older than that. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to duck out of here because I know I got work to do, and I'm sure you do as well. But I do want to say thank you to all of our. I want to say thank you to everyone who tuned in. This was a fun episode and a good discussion. Hopefully, you guys feel the same, and hopefully, you took something away from it. One more time, just in case you didn't catch it, the book that we were talking about is called The Hungry Brain. You can look it up on Amazon. Highly recommend it. Great book. Talks about why we overeat, what you can do about it. So
we get no commission for talking about the book either.
Yeah, no, this is there's no kickback. But hey, Stefan, if you're watching this, maybe consider that because we're really promoting you. I know. I don't know. Maybe he's out in the middle of nowhere just enjoying a quiet, tranquil life at this point. Hopefully he is. So.
That's what I'm trying to do. But you text me every day and need meetings, so I don't know.
That's true. All right. Well, I'm going to duck out of here. So we're going to end this show here. Thank you again, everyone, for watching, and we will be back next week. Until then, adios.
Wow.
Bye.